game at this point. Why do I want to keep doing this to myself? I ended up really loving the process of writing. So I decided, what the heck, I'm going to keep going. I kind of looked at myself and said, why not try to write a mystery? I've never written a mystery before, and I can start fresh and try something new. I thought of Bianca, and I pulled out Bianca from that first story and a couple of other characters that I really liked. I decided to up the stakes for Bianca. I made an attempt to write a mystery. I didn't know what the heck I was doing. I tried to read everything I could find online and books about how to write mysteries, and nothing really spoke to me. And I finally sat down and decided, well, I think I need to write, if I were a reader, what would keep me turning pages? And so I just went with that kind of attitude. I ended up writing the very first Bianca Goddard Mystery. I polished it and got a lot of opinions, got rejected 86 times by agents.
Oh, my goodness.
Finally, I found someone who took me on. It sold to the second publisher who looked at it. So there you go. But Bianca, as far as her personality is, she is kind of a modern woman. I would give that for her time period. I try to keep her playing within the limits of an actual Tudor commoner. She is sort of an unwilling sleuth. She doesn't get involved in mysteries unless it has something personal to do with her. That's kind of how I've set her up. I think it works.
I think you've done a brilliant job.
Well, thank you. I think some people might take umbrage with her modern mindset. I think when you think about her background and where she came from, then it kind of makes sense. And my argument, too, is that there have always been independent, strong women all through history.
We wouldn't get this far as a civilization unless we had some.
Exactly. That's how I feel about it, and there we go. So.
Well, I think in that time period, too, the women who were, like Bianca, is working with her herbal remedies, that's the kind of woman who was more modern. She was more independent.
Yes, she was. And a lot of it stemmed from having to take care of her family. A lot of women did what they had to do to put food on the table. And especially Bianca, coming from family whose father was the alchemist, they often used all of the family's resources to go into buying ingredients and different equipment for their experiments. She grew up knowing what it was like not to have food. So yeah, she decides to strike out on her own. She takes the knowledge that she knows, a little knowledge from her father, some basic chemistry that she learned, and some basic herb medicine lore that she's learned from her mother. And then she creates her own medicines for sale at market, and that's how she survives.
Now, were the herbal remedies that you put into your books, are they real or did you make those up?
They're all made up.
Oh.
So no one go out and try to use them. I do have several books on plants and their medicinal qualities. I try to match disease symptoms with different plants that might work. I think in all of my mysteries, I've stayed pretty close to the major diseases of that time period. For instance, in the second book, Bianca's looking for a remedy for the sweating sickness, which was a horrible disease back then. It could take a person's life within 12 to 24 hours. You would break out in a great, they called it stinking sweat. I try to look for things that might help with fevers and sweating and that sort of thing for that book. But I also, in that book, I wrote it right after the Ebola crisis in our own country. I was thinking, what would it be like if Tudor London was hit with a hemorrhagic fever? How would they react to it? What would they blame as the cause of it? And how would they treat it? That's also what I do. And also in The Alchemist of Lost Souls, there's a patient who has malaria or ague. That remedy, actually, the idea of meadowsweet, I did find in some literature in my research. There was a Scottish remedy for the fever, for any kind of fever. And of course, with malaria, you get fevers and chills. Meadowsweet worked really well in that story for me. I use it in the beginning because it's in bloom, and it's sort of the MacGuffin that gets the story rolling. At the end of the story, Meadowsweet has gone by, and poppies are taking over the field. I was so happy with that I figured that out, because to the British, poppies mean hope and remembrance.
Yes.
Even though that's a World War I thing, I felt like, oh, this is perfect, because at the end of the story, Bianca is remembering her husband, who has gone now, hoping that things will be okay. So yeah.
Very interesting.
What inspired you to write about the daughter of an alchemist at the end of Henry VIII's reign? Why alchemy, and why that time period?
Well, I fell in love with that time period. I was a science major. I never got to take enough literature or history courses in college. One thing I was interested in was learning more about Shakespeare, because I felt pretty ignorant about his plays. Once I got a little bit older, I started checking out his plays and reading them, and I just fell in love with the words. I fell in love with the whole language thing of it. The more I read about the Elizabethans when he lived, I started looking backwards in time towards Henry's reign. Henry just kind of fascinated me. I just wanted to understand why he did the things he did, and all of the politics and religious issues that went on back then. It just kind of grabbed me. And alchemy, I was reading a lot of magic realism back then too. Alchemy just conjured up all kinds of worlds for me, sort of visions and ideas about mysticism and magic and superstition. And London in the 16th century was kind of on the crux of modern society, but they still pulled with them all of these old ancient beliefs from medieval times, some paganism, some superstitions, old beliefs of religion. I just thought, wow, I could merge the two together and have some freedom to kind of play with some of this stuff. That's really what kind of got me going on it.
Research for famous historical figures such as Henry VIII is fairly easy to come by, but how did you research the lower classes and their lives and how they spoke?
Yeah, I do read a lot of nonfiction books about the time period. In just about everything that I read, there will be some sort of reference to the lower class. It may just be in passing or just a mention. I will tend to kind of stow that away, and it gets me thinking, what was it like for the commoners to try to deal with all of this? They had no privilege at all. So how did they deal with their king deciding midstream to change religion completely and make himself basically Pope of England? They had to watch their step. I would say that really it was just the little tidbits that I would get. I'm the kind of person that loves this kind of stuff, and I'll scratch it down on a piece of paper and throw it into a binder. So I have several binders of Tudor history and all kinds of strange little pieces of information that I find. I'll get them out and I'll look at them, and it just kind of gets my mind thinking about all this stuff. So really it's just taking the little bits and pieces of information that I find in reading about other topics and just expanding on them some. And for the language part of it, I just kind of, it's my interpretation of the language. It's not perfect, of course, by any means. It couldn't be. I don't want to alienate people, but I want people to feel like when they read this that they're actually on the streets with Bianca. You know, I want them to feel like, oh, that's how they would think back then. That's how they would talk back then, maybe. And I love archaic words. I have a thing for them. And I think what really got me started was I found a glossary in a library once of Thomas Dekker, who was a playwright around the time of Shakespeare. He was a fellow who didn't make very much money in his life, and he probably ended up in debt, dying in debt. And he was thrown in debtor's prison a few times. He had such a tart way of saying things. Someone compiled a glossary of all of his terms from his different plays and his writings. And I would sit and read that before I went to bed at night. and just, it was great reading. It would just crack me up, some of these things that they would say. I thought it's just a shame that so much of this is lost to time. So part of it is just enjoying finding a funny turn of phrase and putting it in there and having fun with it. You know, a lot of people hate it, but I kind of enjoy putting that stuff in. You know, I've had the history police come after me a couple of times about things that I say, but, you know, I just try to remind people I'm having fun with this. It's not a history book, so don't take it seriously, please.
That's great.
Well, I was glad that you have a glossary in the back of your book, though.
Yeah.
Well, you know, someone said after the first book, they said, why don't you put a glossary in the back? And I was sort of taken aback at first because I thought, well, I thought that you could kind of try to figure things out from the context, but I guess not. So yeah, people are happy with the glossaries.
Some cases I could figure it out, but others I had to look up and say, what is that thing?
Well, I have to tell you, I actually paged through the book, so I like to read the acknowledgments. I like to, you know, see what else is in the book before I start reading it. And I read the glossary first.
Oh, that's good.
So then I was like looking for the different terms while I was reading.
That's great. That's probably the right way to do it. I hadn't thought of that, but it's probably better than getting to the word and then stopping and then saying, okay, what is that? And going to the back and then finding your page again and starting over.
Maybe put glossary in the beginning instead of the end.
Yeah, someone else said that too. I hadn't thought of that. I always think of glossaries as going in the back, but maybe it would be better in the front.
Yeah. Well, in your research of alchemy, are there any practices that are still in use today?
Well, there were a number of alchemists over the centuries that made a lot of contributions. I think we can all agree that alchemy was sort of the framework for modern science, at least in the Western world. Like, I did look up a few alchemists to see what contributions they made, and I found an Indian alchemist who in the 4th century was able to distill zinc. I also found a Spanish alchemist who discovered ether in the 17th century. Also, in my book, The Alchemist of Lost Souls, I kind of base my element, my lapis mortem, on phosphorus, which was actually not discovered officially until the 17th century by a German alchemist. But phosphorus was originally made from the golden stream, if you catch my drift.
Yes.
The alchemists were very fascinated with the golden stream, so to speak.
Bodily functions.
Yes, bodily functions. They believed that would lead them to find the philosopher's stone or perhaps the elixir of immortality. But the thing is about alchemists back then, they didn't have a common or a standard language. They used a lot of symbolism from astrology and mythology, and they would use this to sort of throw off other people from stealing their recipes. So there was no real standardized symbols or methods for figuring out what it was exactly that they were doing. And of course, their idea of elements back then was that elements consisted of air, earth, fire, and water. And of course, these days we know it's based on atomic structure or the number of protons in an element. So really, by the 18th century, alchemy had fallen by the wayside and modern chemistry had been born. It's, of course, been separate ever since. But I think you can make the argument, though, these days that the best chemists combine their science with other sciences, and can pair up with biology and can pair up with physics to create all kinds of inventions that, in a sense, alchemy was doing that back then. They were pairing up with mysticism and religion. They were trying to figure it all out. So yeah, they're an interesting group of men, these alchemists. And so that's sort of my fascination. We all know that they were doomed to failure. How they handled that constant failure was kind of intriguing to me.
Definitely. We read that there will only be one more